Admiral Daniel had served the Galactic Council for 30 years. He had fought in their wars, buried his friends on alien worlds, and never once questioned his loyalty. The Council had welcomed humanity into the stars 300 years ago, and Earth had been grateful ever since. They called humans brave. They called humans valuable allies. They gave humanity a seat at the great table where the galaxy's fate was decided. But on this cold night, aboard the Earth vessel Horizon's Edge, everything Daniel believed was about to shatter into pieces. Lieutenant Commander Amy Grant walked into his private quarters without knocking. Her face was pale, and her hands were shaking as she held a data tablet. She was young, barely 30 years old, but she was the best intelligence officer in the fleet. Daniel had trusted her with the impossible task of decrypting files stolen from a diplomatic vessel 2 months ago. They were the oldest and most powerful species in the Council. They had guided humanity from the very beginning of first contact. Amy placed the tablet on his desk without saying a word. Daniel looked at her eyes and saw something he had never seen before. He saw fear mixed with rage, the kind that burned slow and deep. He picked up the tablet and began to read. The first document was a communication between the High Council and their allies, the Collective. It was dated 312 years ago, just before humanity's first contact with alien life. The message discussed a newly discovered species on a small blue planet called Earth. The scientists had been watching humans for decades. They had studied human history, human wars, human technology, and human biology. Their conclusion was terrifying. Humans were dangerous, not because they were violent, though they certainly could be. Humans were dangerous because they adapted too quickly. They learned too fast. They invented too freely. In just 10,000 years, they had gone from caves to nuclear weapons. Given another 1,000 years, the predicted, humans would surpass every species in the galaxy. The Council could not allow that to happen. Daniel's hands began to tremble as he read further. They had proposed a plan, and the other Council species had agreed. They would not destroy humanity outright. That would be wasteful and might unite the humans against a common enemy. Instead, they would welcome humanity with open arms. They would give them just enough technology to make them dependent, but not enough to threaten Council supremacy. They would praise human courage and send them to fight in every war, placing them always at the front lines where casualties were highest. They would bleed humanity slowly across the centuries. The document included population projections. Before joining the Council, humanity numbered 12 billion. After 300 years of carefully managed wars, that number had fallen to 4 billion. They considered this acceptable progress. Daniel set down the tablet. His vision blurred and he realized he was crying. He thought of his grandfather who had died fighting the insurgency. He thought of his father, killed in the border wars. He thought of his own son, just 18 years old, currently serving on a Council peacekeeping mission in a distant system. All of them had died or were risking death for a lie. He forced himself to keep reading. The documents grew worse with every page. The technology exchanges that humanity celebrated had been carefully designed to create dependency. Human scientists were steered away from certain research areas through subtle manipulation of funding and academic recognition. The colonial territories granted to Earth looked generous on maps, but were actually resource-poor worlds that stretched human logistics to the breaking point. Even the cultural exchange programs had been designed to slowly erode human identity, replacing Earth traditions with Council-approved alternatives. The final pages described the endgame. Within the next decade, the Council planned to manufacture a crisis. A terrorist attack blamed on human extremists would give them justification to demand that Earth surrender its military forces. Human colonies would accept peacekeeping troops. Once humanity was disarmed and scattered, the quiet extinction would begin, not through violence, which might create martyrs, but through careful population control, reduced birth rates, limited medical care, gradual relocation to harsher worlds. In 3 more centuries, Humans would be a footnote in galactic history. Daniel stood up from his desk. He walked to the viewport and stared out at the stars. Those stars had once filled him with wonder and pride. Humanity had reached them, had joined the great community of intelligent life, had proven worthy of a place among the ancient races. Now those same stars looked cold and hostile. Every point of light represented a species that had agreed to humanity's slow murder. Every beautiful nebula hid enemies who smiled while sharpening their knives. Amy Grant waited in silence. She had already processed her own grief and rage in the hours since completing the decryption. Now she watched her admiral, wondering what he would do. Daniel thought about his options. He could take this information to the Earth government, but how many of their leaders had been compromised? The documents mentioned human collaborators, people who knew the truth and helped the Council anyway in exchange for power and privilege. He could not trust the normal channels. He could try to warn the public directly, but the Council controlled most communication networks. Any broadcast would be intercepted and suppressed. The messenger would be discredited or simply disappeared. He could do nothing. He could destroy the files, pretend he never saw them, and live out his remaining years in comfortable ignorance. His son might survive. His might survive. Maybe the projections were wrong. But Daniel had not become an admiral by taking the easy path. He turned back to Amy Grant. His tears had dried and his hands were steady. When he spoke, his voice was calm but carried an edge that made her stand. He told her they were going to need allies, trusted people across the fleet, people who had lost family in council wars, people whose loyalty was to humanity first. They would need to move carefully, communicate secretly, and prepare thoroughly. The Council had 300 years to plan humanity's destruction. Humanity would need time to plan its survival. But survival was not enough for Daniel. The Council had taken everything from humanity while pretending to be friends. They had killed millions while accepting human gratitude. They had built their empire on human bones while smiling for the cameras. Daniel did not want to survive. He wanted revenge. He wanted them to feel what humanity had felt. He wanted them to watch their carefully built plans crumble to dust. He wanted them to know fear, real fear, the kind that woke you up at night and never let you sleep again. The Council had made a terrible mistake. They had spent centuries studying human courage and sacrifice. They knew humans would die for their friends, their families, their beliefs. They had used that knowledge to exploit humanity at every turn. But they had failed to understand what happened when humans learned they had been betrayed. Amy Grant nodded and left to begin her work. Daniel remained at the viewport, watching the stars that had hidden his enemies for so long. The reckoning was coming, and humanity would not show mercy. The message arrived on Captain's personal terminal at 3 in the morning, ship time. He was not sleeping anyway. Sleep had become difficult in the years since his brother died at the Battle of Station, and it had become nearly impossible since he buried his second son on a frozen moon 6 months ago. The message was encrypted with a code had not seen in 20 years, one used by a small group of officers who had trained together as young cadets. He recognized the signature immediately. Daniel, now an admiral, once his closest friend in the academy, decrypted the message and began to read. 2 hours later, he was still sitting in the darkness of his quarters, staring at nothing. His brother, his sons, millions of other humans across 3 centuries, all of them sacrificed in a plan designed to slowly exterminate his species. Was not a man who cried easily. He had learned to bury his grief deep inside, to turn pain into fuel for the next mission. But that night, alone in his quarters aboard the destroyer Swift Vengeance, he wept like a child. Then he dried his eyes and sent his reply to Admiral. He was in. Across human space, similar scenes played out over the following weeks. Had identified 12 officers he trusted completely, people bound to him by shared history and personal loyalty. Each of them received the evidence and reached the same conclusion. Each of them pledged themselves to what called the restoration. On Earth, the message reached retired general through an old friend who still served in naval intelligence. Was 73 years old, but her mind was as sharp as ever. She had spent decades building political connections, rising through the council-approved civilian government to positions of real influence. She had always wondered why her attempts to strengthen Earth's independent capabilities met with quiet resistance from alien advisors. Now she understood. Did not waste time on grief. She was too old and too practical for that. Instead, she began making lists. Lists of politicians she could trust, lists of those who might be collaborators, lists of resources, personnel, and facilities that could be turned to the restoration's purpose. She sent her response to within the hour. She was in, and she was bringing assets. Dr. Samuel Perry received the evidence in his hidden laboratory on a research station orbiting Neptune. Samuel was officially studying theoretical physics under council supervision. Unofficially, he had been conducting forbidden experiments for 15 years, driven by frustration with the technological limitations imposed on human science. The council regulations made no sense to him. Certain research areas were simply prohibited, with no explanation beyond vague warnings about stability and safety. Human scientists who pushed boundaries found their funding cut and their careers destroyed. Samuel had learned to hide his real work behind a facade of approved projects. When he read the decrypted files, everything became clear. The regulations existed to keep humanity weak. The prohibited research areas were exactly the fields that would allow humans to challenge council supremacy. Samuel Perry destroyed his official projects that same day. He devoted every waking hour to the work the council feared most. Within 6 months, his team had developed prototype weapons that exceeded anything the council believed humans capable of creating. They built new drive systems that were faster and more efficient than standard council technology. They designed shields that could withstand weapons currently used against human vessels. They had underestimated human ingenuity. That mistake would cost them everything. The restoration grew slowly and carefully, knew that speed would mean discovery, and discovery would mean death. The council had eyes everywhere, surveillance systems monitoring every communication network, observers embedded in every human institution. The conspirators met in person whenever possible. They used the cover of routine military exercises, diplomatic functions, and family gatherings. They developed codes and signals that looked innocent to outside observers. They built a network of trusted contacts who could pass messages without electronic traces. General identified a list of human collaborators, people who knowingly served the council's agenda in exchange for power and privilege. The list included 3 senators, a dozen high-ranking military officers, and several prominent business leaders. These traitors would need to be neutralized when the time came, but moving too early would alert the council. Captain focused on military preparation. He identified officers throughout the fleet who could be recruited, ships that could be quietly modified, and supply chains that could be redirected. He established training programs disguised as standard exercises, pushing his crews harder than regulations allowed, preparing them for battles that would require everything they had. Commander Lisa, one of his most trusted operatives, began building an intelligence network behind enemy lines. She traveled to alien worlds under diplomatic cover, making contacts among species who had their own grievances against the council. They had oppressed many races over their long history. Some of them might welcome the chance to strike back. The Restoration established hidden shipyards in the outer reaches of human territory, beyond the regular patrol routes of council observers. Old mining facilities were converted into weapons factories. Asteroid bases became training camps. Colony worlds on the frontier quietly stockpiled supplies and prepared defensive positions. 2 years passed in secret preparation. During those 2 years, humanity continued to play its assigned role. Human diplomats smiled at their counterparts and praised the wisdom of the Council. Human soldiers served in Council military operations, fighting and dying for causes they now knew were designed to weaken them. Human tribute ships delivered their cargo on schedule, feeding the very system that planned their extinction. The deception was perfect. The Council saw nothing unusual in human behavior. Their surveillance systems detected no signs of conspiracy. Their collaborators reported that humanity remained docile and obedient. They had no idea that behind every smile was the memory of betrayal. Admiral spent those 2 years planning every detail of the coming uprising. He studied Council military doctrine, identifying weaknesses that could be exploited. He analyzed the political relationships between Council species, looking for fractures that could be widened. He prepared contingency plans for every scenario he could imagine. He also spent time with his son, who returned from his peacekeeping mission unaware of the storm gathering around him. Watched the young man talk about his service with pride, describing the alien cultures he had encountered and the friends he had made among other species. It broke his heart to know that those friendships were built on lies. But he did not tell his son the truth. Not yet. The restoration required absolute secrecy until the moment of action. One careless word could doom them all. General consolidated her political network, placing trusted people in key positions throughout the Earth government. When the time came, the transition of power would need to be swift and bloodless. Human fighting human would only serve the Council's interests. Dr. Perry continued his research, each breakthrough bringing humanity closer to technological parity with the. His team worked in shifts, sleeping in their laboratory to maximize productive hours. They knew that every weapon they created might save human lives in the war to come. Captain trained his crews until they could fight in their sleep. He pushed them beyond exhaustion, beyond complaint, beyond anything they thought possible. They did not know why their captain demanded such perfection, but they trusted him. When the truth finally emerged, they would understand. Commander built her network of alien contacts, carefully cultivating relationships with species who harbored resentment against the Council. She discovered that they had used similar tactics against other races, though none had been targeted for complete extinction like humanity. Still, there were allies to be found among the oppressed. The restoration was ready. All they needed was the right moment to strike. That moment came sooner than anyone expected, delivered by the very Council that sought humanity's destruction. They had grown impatient. 300 years was a long time, even for a species that measured its history in. They decided to accelerate their plan. The final phase was about to begin, and humanity was waiting. The explosion tore through the diplomatic station like a fist through paper. 300 diplomats died instantly, along with 50 human staff members who had been working in the building. The blast was felt across the entire orbital platform, shattering windows and triggering emergency systems throughout the station. Within hours, the Council released its investigation findings. A human extremist group called the Earth Liberation Front had claimed responsibility. Evidence recovered from the blast site included human DNA, human weapons components, and encrypted communications traced back to Earth military servers. The evidence was perfect, too perfect. Admiral Daniel watched the Council broadcast from his quarters aboard Horizon's Edge. The High Arbiter stood before an assembly of representatives from every Council species, his ancient face arranged in an expression of sorrow and disappointment. He spoke of humanity's debt to the Council, the centuries of guidance and protection they had received, the trust that had been so cruelly betrayed. He announced emergency measures effective immediately. All human military vessels were ordered to surrender their weapons systems and submit to Council inspection crews. Human colonies would accept peacekeeping forces to ensure public safety. Earth itself would be required to disband its planetary defense network within 30 days. The High Arbiter expressed hope that these temporary measures would allow humanity to prove its continued loyalty to the galactic community. Once the extremist threat was eliminated, normal relations could resume. Turned off the broadcast. He had known this moment was coming. The decrypted files had described exactly this scenario, a manufactured crisis used to justify disarmament. The only surprise was the timing. The Council had moved faster than the Restoration expected. But faster did not mean unprepared. Opened a secure channel to every Restoration asset across human space. The code phrase was simple, just 3 words that would change everything. He spoke them clearly, knowing that millions of lives depended on what happened next. The time has come. Across the galaxy, humans received the message and began to act. Captain was commanding a patrol near the Sol system border when the order arrived. He immediately changed course toward the nearest surveillance station, a massive orbital facility that monitored all traffic entering human territory. His crew looked confused but followed orders without question. They had been trained to trust their captain. Opened a channel to the station commander, a military officer named Vex who had spent 20 years watching human ships come and go. Vex was not a bad person by standards. He was simply doing his job, unaware of the larger conspiracy his work supported. Gave Vex one chance to surrender. The commander laughed and reminded that Council regulations prohibited human vessels from approaching surveillance stations without authorization. He ordered to turn back immediately or face consequences. Cut the communication and gave the order to fire. The new weapons Dr. Perry had developed worked exactly as designed. Blue energy beams cut through the station's shields like they were made of paper. Secondary explosions rippled across the hull as power systems overloaded. The entire engagement lasted less than 4 minutes. When it was over, the surveillance station was dark and drifting. No escape pods had launched. No distress signals had been sent. The crew had died before they understood what was happening. Felt nothing. These were the same people who had watched humanity bleed for 3 centuries without lifting a finger to help. They had earned their fate. On Earth, General coordinated the most delicate phase of the uprising. Her network had identified every human collaborator in positions of power, and teams were moving to arrest them simultaneously. The operation required perfect timing. If even one traitor escaped and warned the Council, the element of surprise would be lost. The arrests went smoothly. Most collaborators surrendered without resistance, too shocked by the sudden reversal of fortune to fight back. A few tried to flee or call for help, but people had anticipated every possibility. By dawn, every known traitor was in custody. Addressed the Earth Assembly that morning, presenting the same evidence that had launched the Restoration 2 years earlier. She showed them the documents, the population projections, the detailed plans for humanity's extinction. She let the representatives read for themselves the words their supposed allies had written about them. The reaction was everything she had hoped for. Shock gave way to anger, and anger gave way to determination. The Assembly voted unanimously to reject Council authority and support the Restoration's military operations. Earth was at war. Admiral broadcast his own message across every frequency humanity could reach. He wanted every human in the galaxy to hear the truth, and he wanted the Council to know that their secrets were exposed. He spoke for 30 minutes, laying out the evidence in clear and simple terms. He described the engineered wars that had killed millions. He explained the technological restrictions designed to keep humanity weak. He revealed the endgame, the quiet extinction that awaited their children, and if they did not act. Then he announced humanity's declaration of independence. We reject the authority of the Galactic Council. We reject the lies we have been told for 300 years. We reject the future they have planned for us. From this moment forward, humanity stands alone, free, and determined to survive. The Council's response came within hours. The High Arbiter declared humanity in rebellion against galactic law. All human vessels were ordered destroyed on sight. All human colonies were subject to military occupation. Earth itself was placed under blockade. The war had begun. Commander Lisa was behind enemy lines when the uprising started. She had been cultivating contacts among the and species whose history with the was almost as troubled as humanity's. When news of the rebellion spread, her contacts came to her with an offer. They wanted to join the fight. Learned that they had secretly sterilized large portions of the population decades ago, using medical programs disguised as public health initiatives. The leadership had discovered the truth but had been too afraid to act. Now, with humanity striking first, they saw their chance. Established secure communications between resistance leaders and Admiral. Within weeks, warships were fighting alongside human vessels, their crews eager to repay centuries of cruelty. The rebellion spread further. The amphibious traders who had been systematically impoverished through unfair commerce treaties began refusing to supply Council fleets. Their merchant ships carried restoration supplies instead, moving through trade routes the Council could not easily monitor. Even some commanders defected. These were officers who had grown disgusted by the dishonorable nature of the conspiracy against humanity. They could not support the extermination of an innocent species, regardless of what their government ordered. The Council had expected humanity to stand alone. Instead, they faced a growing coalition of species united by shared grievances and common purpose. Dr. Samuel Perry worked without sleep during those first chaotic weeks. His laboratory became a production facility, manufacturing weapons and equipment as fast as possible. Every ship that received his technology gained an advantage over Council forces. The results spoke for themselves. In the first month of open warfare, humanity destroyed over 200 Council vessels while losing fewer than 40 of their own. The new shields held against weapons that had once torn human ships apart. The new drives allowed human fleets to strike and retreat before the enemy could respond. They were learning what it meant to fight humanity on equal terms. But the war was far from won. The Council still held overwhelming numerical superiority. For every ship humanity destroyed, 3 more arrived to replace it. They had built their empire over 10,000 years, and they would not surrender it easily. Admiral understood that conventional victory was impossible. Humanity could not match the Council's resources in a prolonged conflict. They needed to fight smarter, to strike at the foundations of Council power rather than trying to overwhelm it through force. The next phase of the war would require patience, precision, and sacrifice. Humanity was ready to provide all 3. The war that historians would later call the War of Reclamation entered its second year with no end in sight. Admiral Daniel stood before a holographic map of the galaxy, studying the positions of fleets and the reports from 100 different battlefronts. The map was covered with markers showing victories and defeats, advances and retreats, the constant movement of forces across light years of space. Humanity was winning, but winning slowly. The early successes had given way to a grinding conflict. The Council had recovered from its initial shock and adapted to human tactics. Commanders learned to respect human weapons and began developing countermeasures. The numerical advantage that had always belonged to the Council began to tell. Knew that time was not on humanity's side. Every month of war cost lives and resources that could not be easily replaced. The Council could absorb losses that would cripple humanity. They needed to find a way to accelerate the conflict, to break the enemy's will before their own strength was exhausted. The answer came from Commander Lisa. Had spent the past year building networks behind enemy lines, cultivating contacts among dissatisfied species, and gathering intelligence on Council operations. Her reports painted a picture of an alliance under stress. The had ruled through a combination of fear and economic manipulation but humanity's rebellion was exposing the cracks in their system. Many council species resented dominance. They had been forced to accept unfavorable treaties, provide tribute that enriched worlds while impoverishing their own, and send their young to fight in wars that served interests. The rebellion offered them a chance they had never imagined possible. Proposed a campaign of targeted disruption. Rather than fighting the council's military directly, they would attack its political and economic foundations. They would sabotage infrastructure, spread the truth of council crimes among oppressed populations, and give weapons and training to species willing to fight for their own freedom. Approved the plan immediately. Assembled a special operations unit from the best soldiers humanity had available. They trained for 6 months in techniques of infiltration, sabotage, and unconventional warfare. Then they deployed behind enemy lines, where they would spend the next 2 years tearing the council apart from within. Their first target was a shipyard complex in the Tertian system. The facility produced a quarter of all new warships, a critical asset for the council's war effort. His team infiltrated the complex using forged credentials and insider contacts cultivated over months. They planted explosives in key locations and disappeared before anyone noticed their presence. The explosion destroyed 6 warships under construction and damaged the facility beyond repair. More importantly, it demonstrated that they were vulnerable even in their most secure locations. The psychological impact was enormous. For the first time in 10,000 years, they felt unsafe in their own territory. Security measures were tightened across the empire, diverting resources from the war effort and creating friction with allied species who resented the increased scrutiny. His team continued their campaign. They assassinated key military commanders whose tactical brilliance had caused humanity particular trouble. They disrupted supply lines that fed council forces on the frontier. They hacked into communication networks and broadcast evidence of council crimes to populations that had never heard the truth. The seeds of rebellion spread across the galaxy. On the colony world of New Pittsburgh, Captain Gregory faced the greatest challenge of his military career. An invasion force had arrived in the system, 3 times the size of his defensive garrison. The enemy commander offered surrender terms that would spare civilian lives in exchange for immediate capitulation. Rejected the offer. New Pittsburgh was a mining colony, its population scattered across dozens of settlements in harsh mountain terrain. Knew his people could not defeat thee in open battle, but they did not need to. They only needed to hold out long enough for reinforcements to arrive. He dispersed his forces across the planet, using the difficult terrain to negate the enemy's numerical advantage. Civilian volunteers joined the defense, farmers and miners who had never held weapons before, but refused to surrender their homes to alien occupation. The battle lasted 6 weeks. They landed their troops expecting quick victory. Instead, they found an enemy that refused to stay in one place, that struck from ambush and melted into the mountains before retaliation could arrive. Human defenders knew every valley and cave, every hidden path and defensible position. They made the invaders pay for every kilometer of ground. Led from the front, personally commanding the most dangerous missions, he lost count of the friends he buried during those 6 weeks. Every day brought new casualties, new grief, new reasons to consider surrender. But every day also brought news of the damage they were inflicting, the enemy convoys destroyed, the positions overrun, the officers killed. The commander grew increasingly frustrated. His casualties mounted while his objectives remained unachieved. His troops, accustomed to quick victories against inferior opponents, began losing morale. Reports of the long campaign spread through council forces, damaging the perception of invincibility. On the 42nd day, reinforcements arrived. Captain led a battle group of 12 human warships into the New Pittsburgh system. His vessels were outnumbered, but carried the latest weapons from Dr. Perry's laboratories. They tore into the fleet with devastating efficiency. The enemy commander attempted to retreat, but had positioned his forces to cut off the escape routes. The battle became a rout. Ships burned in the void while their ground forces scrambled for evacuation that would never come. When it was over, the survivors surrendered. For the first time in the war, humanity had captured a significant force intact. The prisoners would provide valuable intelligence about enemy plans and capabilities. His defense of New Pittsburgh became legendary. His story spread across human space, inspiring other colonies to resist occupation rather than surrender. It spread further, reaching alien species who had believed they could not be defeated. If humans could win against such odds, perhaps others could too. The alliance against the Council continued to grow. The uprising escalated into full-scale civil war. Forces were diverted from the human front to suppress the rebellion, stretching their resources thin. They declared neutrality and refused to transport Council military supplies, crippling logistics across multiple sectors. 2 years into the war, the unthinkable happened. The collective formally from the Galactic Council. Their ambassador appeared before the Earth Assembly to deliver the announcement in person. He was an elderly named who had served his government for over a century. He spoke with obvious difficulty, forcing words past what appeared to be genuine shame. He acknowledged the role in the conspiracy against humanity. He admitted that his people had known the truth and done nothing to prevent it. He offered no excuses, only an apology that he knew could never be enough. Then he offered something more valuable than words. The collective would provide full access to their intelligence networks, including detailed information about military deployments and defensive positions. They would open their shipyards to human vessels for repair and resupply. They would commit their own military forces to fight against their former allies. The war had reached a turning point. Admiral accepted the surrender with grace, understanding that revenge would only create new enemies. Humanity needed allies more than it needed to punish every species that had wronged it. They would have to earn trust through action, but they would be given the chance. The Council's alliance was crumbling. Species that had once feared retaliation saw that resistance was possible. Those who had been exploited recognized that the old order was dying. Even those with no particular grievance against began calculating the odds and choosing the winning side. The Dominion stood increasingly alone. Admiral began planning the final campaign. The intelligence provided by the revealed weaknesses in defenses that could be exploited. The combined fleets of humanity and its new allies would strike at the heart of the enemy's power. The war would end where it had begun, in the home system. And humanity would be there to see it fall. The home system had not seen foreign warships in 8,000 years. The last species foolish enough to challenge dominance in their own territory had been exterminated so thoroughly that even their name was forgotten. They believed their home was untouchable, protected by distance, defenses, and the certainty that no enemy could ever gather enough strength to threaten it. They were wrong. Admiral Daniel stood on the bridge of his flagship, now renamed Reckoning, watching the fleet emerge from faster-than-light travel at the edge of space. Around him, the largest military force in galactic history assembled for the final battle. Human warships flew alongside carriers, cruisers, support vessels, and ships from a dozen other species united against common tyranny. 3 years of war had brought them to this moment. They had prepared their defenses well. Orbital fortresses ringed there, each one bristling with weapons capable of destroying entire fleets. Thousands of warships patrolled the system, representing the concentrated military power of a 10,000-year-old empire. Defensive satellites created overlapping fields of fire that would shred any attacking force. The High Arbiter broadcast a message to the approaching fleet. His voice carried the weight of the absolute certainty of a species that had never known true defeat. He declared that the Dominion would never surrender, that the defenders would destroy every invading ship or die in the attempt. He promised that even if fell, the galaxy would remember the cost of challenging their supremacy. Did not respond. Words were no longer necessary. The battle began at dawn local time, as the Allied fleet engaged the outer defensive perimeter. Weapons filled space with deadly light, destroying dozens of attacking ships in the first minutes. The fortresses were as powerful as intelligence had suggested, each one capable of engaging multiple targets simultaneously. But the Allied commanders had planned for this. Captain led the assault on the largest fortress, commanding a strike force of human and vessels. His ship took heavy damage in the approach, losing shields and suffering hull breaches that killed a third of his crew. He pressed the attack anyway, knowing that hesitation meant death for others who depended on his success. His weapons found the fortress's reactor core. The explosion was visible from orbit around the. Across the system, similar scenes played out. Allied forces suffered terrible casualties but continued advancing, paying in blood for every kilometer of space they gained. They fought with the desperation of a species facing extinction, throwing everything they had against the invaders. Commander Lisa led her special operations teams onto the surface of the itself. They had infiltrated the system weeks earlier, hiding among civilian populations and preparing for this moment. When the battle began, they emerged to strike at communication centers, power stations, and military command facilities. They found themselves fighting an enemy that was everywhere and nowhere. Their coordinated defense began to break down as commanders lost contact with their forces. Decisions that should have taken seconds stretched into minutes, and minutes in battle meant death. Dr. Samuel Perry had prepared one final weapon for this engagement. He called it the Silencer, a device that disrupted the power systems of enemy vessels without destroying them entirely. Perry had argued that captured ships would be more valuable than debris, and that killing enemy crews would only deepen the hatred between species. Had agreed. Humanity was fighting for survival, but they were also fighting for the kind of future they wanted to build. The Silencer was deployed against the main fleet during the third day of battle. Ships that had been fighting moments before went dark, their weapons and engines disabled. Thousands of warriors found themselves drifting helplessly in disabled vessels, waiting for capture or death. Most chose surrender. By the fourth day, organized resistance had collapsed. The orbital fortresses were destroyed or captured. The defensive fleet was reduced to scattered survivors fleeing into deep space. The ground forces defending them had been isolated and cut off from support. The High Council requested terms for surrender. Admiral met with the surviving leaders in the ancient chamber where the Galactic Council had once decided humanity's fate. The room was vast, designed to impress visitors with the power and majesty of civilization. Now it felt hollow, stripped of meaning by defeat. The High Arbiter knelt before, his ancient body trembling with exhaustion and shame. He offered unconditional surrender, asking only that the people be spared from extermination. Looked at the broken leader who had ordered humanity's slow death. He thought about the millions who had died in engineered wars, the futures that had been stolen, the children who would never be born because the Council had decided humanity did not deserve to exist. He thought about his grandfather, his father, his son who had survived the war and would help build whatever came next. He could destroy every human in the galaxy would understand. 3 centuries of manipulation, millions of engineered deaths and attempted genocide. Justice demanded punishment. Revenge demanded blood. But had not fought this war to become what he hated. He accepted the surrender and announced the terms. The Dominion was dissolved. Their territories would be divided among the species they had oppressed, administered by representatives chosen fairly from all populations. Military forces were disbanded, their weapons destroyed. The leaders who had planned and executed the conspiracy against humanity would face trial for crimes against sentient life. But there would be no genocide, no collective punishment of innocent civilians, no systematic destruction of culture or identity. The species would survive, humbled but alive, with the chance to become something better than they had been. Humanity would not become what it had fought against. The trials lasted 3 years. Evidence was presented in open proceedings broadcast across the galaxy. Leaders who had participated in the conspiracy were convicted and sentenced to terms ranging from imprisonment to permanent exile. Some chose suicide rather than face judgment, their deaths witnessed by the species they had wronged. A new galactic assembly was formed to replace the corrupt council. This time, membership was based on genuine equality and mutual respect. No species would hold permanent dominance. Decisions would require broad consensus. Transparency would prevent future conspiracies from taking root. Human representatives sat at the center of the new order, not as conquerors, but as founders of a system designed to protect everyone. They had earned this position through sacrifice and wisdom, through the choice to show mercy when cruelty would have been easier. Admiral retired to a quiet colony world after the war. He declined offers of political power and refused to write memoirs that would have made him wealthy. He had fought for humanity's freedom, not for personal glory. He spent his remaining years gardening, watching sunsets, and playing with his. When he died at the age of 92, his funeral was attended by representatives of every species in the assembly. Even sent a delegation, acknowledging the debt they owed to the man who had defeated them and then chosen to let them live. Captain became the first commander of the Galactic Defense Force, a unified military organization dedicated to protecting all member species equally. He spent 20 years building an institution that would prevent future wars through strength and deterrence. When he retired, the galaxy was more peaceful than it had been in. Commander Lisa established an intelligence agency focused on transparency and accountability. Her organization monitored for signs of conspiracy and corruption, ensuring that no future plot could develop undetected. She trained a generation of agents who believed that truth was the best weapon against tyranny. Dr. Samuel Perry continued his research with unlimited resources and galactic collaboration. His discoveries advanced medicine, transportation, and energy production for every species. He lived to see human life expectancy double and child mortality become virtually unknown. He died in his laboratory at the age of 107, still working on problems that would benefit future generations. General served as Earth's first representative to the new assembly. She helped draft the charter that governed interstellar relations, ensuring that the principles humanity had fought for would endure. She returned to Earth at the age of 90, finally ready to rest after a lifetime of service. The galaxy was not perfect after the war. Old resentments lingered between species that had fought on opposite sides. New conflicts arose over resources and territory. Some individuals and groups rejected the new order and worked to undermine it. But for the first time in recorded history, there was genuine hope for a better future. Species that had been enemies learned to cooperate. Technologies were shared freely, lifting all civilizations together. Children grew up believing that peace was possible and worth fighting for. Humanity had been deceived, manipulated, and marked for extinction. They had responded not with blind rage but with calculated determination. They had won their freedom and then extended that freedom to others. They had proven that strength and mercy could coexist, that victory did not require cruelty. The stars that had once hidden their enemies now shone with promise. And the galaxy would never underestimate humanity again.